Some 2,000 years ago, Mark wrote those words that we just heard from Peter. Mark wrote those words that say, there will be wars and famines and floods. Nations will rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms, but that is not the end. Every author has an audience. And when we're talking about the Gospel of Mark or anything in the Bible, there are at least three audiences. The audience inside the text, the audience of the author, who he is writing to, and every reader after that would be the third one, which is really like lots more audiences, right? And today I want to look at those three for this text that we have to see what that might teach us about what's going on here. So first, let's look at the story. The setting is Jerusalem, where they are just leaving the temple. It's a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. The temple was not a common place for them to go. They didn't live in Jerusalem. They lived in Galilee, and they traveled around to lots of other small towns and villages. They didn't hang out in the big city. And when they went to Jerusalem then, they were like the country kids who go to the big city. Jerusalem was a special trip for holidays. They were admiring the large stones of the temple, wondering in the same way that we might how they got built, these huge stones, which is why they say, what large stones? So you can imagine like a holiday kind of situation with one caveat, that it was under Roman occupation. So it wasn't exactly like open streets or holidazzle. It was maybe a little bit more like when the Super Bowl was here and there were like tanks that would block, and Pride Festival, I've seen tanks at Pride Festival here too. That kind of thing, except way worse because that's not really being under occupation. But like, just imagine the Jewish people at this time were allowed to practice their religion, but it definitely made Rome nervous to have that many people gathering in one place at one time. So there was always a high security presence, and I imagine very intimidating. Rome's way of keeping peace, the Pax Romana, was a relative peace. Everything will be fine as long as you do exactly what we say. So, if you've ever been traveling in a place with a heavy military presence, with checkpoints and armed guards, Haiti perhaps, it's more like that. Jesus was super aware of this presence, and he was not feeling the vacation vibe. Jerusalem was a dangerous place for him to go. He knew that his body was in danger in this place. He knew that when he went to Jerusalem for a festival, he was also going there to die. There were too many people saying too many things about him. He was accused of healing on the Sabbath, along with his disciples, picking grain on the Sabbath, in other words, working on the Sabbath. The healing on the Sabbath is also a problem because if he's a healer, that's his job, and he's working on the Sabbath. He was accused of claiming to be God or having godlike powers, also the healing thing. He never actually made that claim out loud, but that was a part of the accusation that they were trying to bring against him. The state doesn't really care about that, but the religious leaders, the ones who knew that in order to keep the peace and be able to keep doing what they did and practicing their religion freely, they had to keep people calm and collected, keep people from acting out, because all of these people were following Jesus and telling these strange stories. So Jesus is upsetting that relative peace. So as this celebration is going on around him, as people make their visits to the temple and walk around the city markets, Jesus is there with a lot on his mind. And probably a good deal of anxiety that he's holding in his body. Probably sadness for all the people around him. A mixed bag of people whom he loves, people who will do and say incredibly stupid things. And some of those incredibly stupid things are the things that will put him on the cross. With all those feelings in mind, he has some dark things to say in response to, do you see these great buildings? Their admiration of the temple. Look at these stones. Not one, he says, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on stone. All will be thrown down. The disciples never have enough information to understand most of what Jesus says, because they're listening to him as life was going on without knowing the rest of the story in the same way that we do. But they do have a lot of questions. When is this going to happen? And how will it take place? And what will be the sign that it is about to happen? He answers, beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom will rise against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines, but this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Well, like I said, this isn't going to make a lot of sense to these guys. Jesus is just a guy, an amazing teacher and a healer, and maybe the one that they believe was the one who was sent to save them, if you understand save as being saved from the Roman government, but a guy that they are walking around with. So what could he possibly mean by, many will come saying, I am he? But don't be fooled. I can remember that this happened with Osama bin Laden. There were Osama bin Laden decoys, a bunch of them, so that it was hard for him to be captured. But in general, if you're part of a circle, an inner circle of 12 guys, what could he possibly mean by many will come and say, I am he? But do not be fooled. And then he goes on to talk about all kinds of things like earthquakes and famines and wars, but that is not the end. And all of that sounds like a long time, because wars take a long time most of the time, maybe not in the 6-Day War. And famines take a long time. And, 100 Years' War. And it turns out it has been a long time since then. It would all have been rather confusing and probably a little scary to these disciples. By the end of the week, after they had lived through the chaos of what we call Holy Week, the week when Jesus would be arrested and tried and ultimately killed by the state, by the end of that week, they would understand a little bit more, because they'd been living what felt like their own end times by that point. But these are just the birth pangs. Who is Mark, and who is he writing to? This guy whose name is on this gospel, in the gospel according to Mark. So we don't know, although his name was probably not Mark. This text was believed to be written 50 to 70 years after Jesus died. It is the first of the Gospels to have been written. He wrote these words in the aftermath, or near the end of a war that destroyed the temple. Those large stones did get thrown down. This audience, you can imagine as if Mark had dedicated this book, it would say something like, for my people, the congregation of Mark, if that was his name, which we think it wasn't. I imagine Mark, or the words ascribed to this person eventually named Mark, as a pastor of a community that's figuring out how to make meaning out of their lives and find ways of following Jesus. That's what all the Gospels, I think, are doing. So Mark tells this story of Jesus in a particular way for whoever he was gathered around, who are going to hear it in a particular way based on where they are and what they know and what they're experiencing in their own lives in the late stages of a war or in the ruins of a war. By now, those large stones have already fallen down. They're going to hear the words of Jesus in a different way. They may hear them as a prediction that the temple would be destroyed, that Jesus predicted this thing that they have literally just lived through. It may be yet another sign for them that he knew things, that he was divine. For them, the words of Jesus would be less confusing, maybe even less fear-inducing, maybe even more hopeful. Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. They already knew people who had been led astray. They already knew what would happen to Jesus. They already knew the temple was destroyed, and they knew all about living through a war. The hope for them in this text is that Jesus knew this would happen and said, this is not the end. In fact, it's a beginning. The birth pangs. And now the third audience, or the multitude of audiences, the audience of us and everybody of people down through those 2,000 years that have read these words. See, Mark might have scribed those words to his community, dedicated this book to them, but they live on and are codified and became part of this canon that we call the Holy Scripture, meaning that all people across all time are also audiences to this word from Jesus. And we know from this vantage point in our strange location as compared to that one, very little about temples and how they were built by hand and what their meaning and purpose held for a religious community. But in these 2,000 years, there have been wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines, and kingdoms and nations have risen and fallen. The maps are always shifting. And in many of those places, there have been people reading these lines, knowing something of what it feels like to feel like the world is ending. In fact, let's just think about that temple for a second, the one with those large stones. Jesus got it partly right. Most of the temple did fall. One wall remains, the Western Wall. Some call it the Wailing Wall. And it still exists. It's a sacred space, but nations rising against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms have meant that it has fallen under the control of different bodies of government and different religious groups down through the millennia. For us here today, many worry about our country in these days. And even before the events of this month, we know that the power that our country holds in this world is held for good and for ill in all kinds of places. It would not be too much of a stretch to say that in many places, people would experience our country like these disciples experienced Rome. And we know that for some of us, that feeling is now in our bodies too. If you're queer, if you're not white, if you're a woman, if you're undocumented or underdocumented, the violent rhetoric of these times, the permission giving from the highest office to come, that will likely also result in policy and policing, is deeply scary. And it does feel like the end of something. So what does Jesus have to say to us with these words today? Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. You could almost imagine we were the only ones he was talking to. With all of the misinformation, with the rise of Christian nationalism, with the ways it feels like everything is being twisted to some kind of bizarro opposite world. How, for instance, just as one example, how did guns become a Christian value? How could that happen on a religion based on a guy who lowered Peter's sword and healed the ear of the person he had just struck before they arrested and then killed him? How does that happen? Many will come and say, I am he. The message of this text is that none of this is new. The world is always ending for someone, somewhere. And for some of us, it feels like things are ending now. And for others in the world, it could be part of this broad audience, since we're online, it could feel like a beginning. And it is, because the reality is we just don't get to know what a sign is of what is the ending and what is the beginning, and the two are too close together to know. Look back for a moment at that strange T.S. Eliot poem from the beginning of worship today, a man who also says very confusing words very often, or did. But maybe they can make a little bit more sense to us in this context that we're talking about. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. This kind of end of the world text is showing up for us to preach on right now. Like I said at the beginning, not because of the United States elections. This is a text assigned to this date in like 1993 because there's this group of people who sat down and figured out like how can we hear most of the Bible in a 3-year cycle, and they rotate the scripture around these 3 years. And people all over the world follow this 3-year cycle. And it takes us through lots of different parts of the Bible. And the purpose is so that preachers like me don't just preach on the text that we want to preach on, and don't get accused of, I don't know, like making the Bible work for us instead of the Holy Scripture working on us. But it comes at the end of the church year. The church year begins with Advent, which for us this year is December 1st. And Advent should be understood as a dark time. Jesus didn't come into the world because it was all light and grace. He came because he was needed, and still is. And we have these stories to help us understand some things about Jesus, and some things about life, and some things about death and beginnings and endings from this story. Besides those things about beginnings and endings, we also know that Jesus knows what it is like to be alive in a place where your physical body is at risk. Jesus knows people who will do and say incredibly stupid things that put innocent lives in danger, including people in his own inner circle who will give him up to the authorities. Jesus knows about authoritarian rule and what it's like to live under that and keep hope alive in the midst of it. And into those places, he preaches these words. Not, I will take over. Not, fight, but do not be alarmed. These are but the birth pangs. I've never given birth before. I hear that it's painful. Well, actually, I hear that each birth story is different. Incredibly unique and different for people. And for some people, it's really painful, and it's less so for others. And for some children, it's less so than other children, too. Like every single one is going to be different, and even the pain will be different. But I wondered what it would be like if you found yourself in the midst of labor and you didn't know you were pregnant. I'm imagining, if you didn't know what was happening, that it would be an incredibly scary and painful and chaotic experience, because I think it's that anyway, for many times. And in some situations, you might feel like the world is ending. I mean, something inside you is moving and trying to come out, and you don't even know what it is. It's like, makes me think of a scene from Alien. That's a movie from a long time ago, by the way. I asked this question of my closest group of pastor friends this week, and one of them relayed this experience, which was new for me, that you're hooked up to this machine, and if you have any of your wits about you, you can see the contractions coming on this machine. And your uterus is going to contract on its own without you having any ability to stop it. The uterus is gonna, you didn't think you were gonna hear your pastor saying uterus multiple times today, did you? Hope I'm not making anyone uncomfortable. The uterus is gonna work to get that baby out. For her, getting the epidural is what helped her be able to participate in giving birth rather than having it happen to her. That without it, it would just like birth was going to just happen. And without the epidural, it was so intense that she was out of her mind for about 24 hours, and labor was just happening to her. Once she had some control over the pain, she was able to participate in giving birth. So when you do that, when you see that contraction is coming, you see this on TV all the time, just like me, you just have to push really hard with your whole body and breath so that you're working with what your uterus is already doing. So that, I hope I'm not giving anyone any trauma. So that your body aligns with what is happening inside you, because if you don't, it will feel like war inside you. These Advent times, these are the birth pangs. And we're going to have to get aligned and watch for the movement for when that contraction is going to take over. And then we have to push really hard and breathe with it. Don't clip that. And that is always the task. We just feel it more intensely sometimes, maybe because we're in a contraction, in between the contractions. These are always the birth pangs, because Jesus is always coming into this world. That is why when I say those words at communion, until and as he comes again, which is like not a normal thing for pastors to say, but I just believe it's true. Until and as he comes again. It will all be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Because I believe that God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and God is love. So if it doesn't look like love, then it's not God. And it isn't, and if it isn't God and if it isn't love, then it isn't the end. But it may be the birth pangs. So get ready for the labor. Something is about to be born.